On the morning of May 25, 1942, Commander Joseph Rochefort stood in the basement of the 14th Naval District Administration Building at Pearl Harbor, holding a decoded fragment that would change the course of the Pacific War. The message was incomplete, garbled in places where his team had not yet broken through the encryption, but two characters stood out with absolute clarity. AF. AF was a target. The Japanese combined fleet was planning something massive, something that would commit carriers, battleships, cruisers, and thousands of men to an operation the Imperial Navy believed would be the decisive engagement of the war. Rochefort's Codebreakers had been reading fragments of Japanese naval traffic for weeks, piecing together references to AF in message after message. The operation was scheduled for early June. That much was certain. But AF could be anywhere in the vast Pacific. It could be Hawaii itself, another strike at the heart of American naval power. It could be the Aleutians, a flanking move to threaten the American homeland from the north. It could be Samoa, Fiji, or any of a dozen strategic locations the Japanese might consider worth the risk of committing their carrier fleet. The Japanese Admiralty had spent 6 months planning this operation. They had run war games at the Naval Staff College in Tokyo. They had calculated fuel consumption, ammunition requirements, and aircraft sortie rates. They had coordinated with Army units for amphibious landings. They had crafted elaborate deception plans to confuse American intelligence. Every detail had been refined, every contingency considered. The operation orders ran to hundreds of pages. Security was absolute. The plans were distributed only to flag officers and select staff. Radio transmissions were encoded using the Imperial Japanese Navy's most sophisticated cipher system, a code the Japanese cryptographic experts believed was mathematically unbreakable. CTA, at approximately 145 words. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. They were wrong. In the basement at Pearl Harbor, working in shifts around the clock in a space the men called the dungeon, Rochefort's team was reading their mail. Not every message, not every word, but enough. Enough to know that something called AF was about to become the most important piece of real estate in the Pacific. Enough to know that the Japanese were coming with everything they had. Enough to know that if the Americans could identify AF and get there first, they could turn Japanese planning into a death trap. The irony was absolute. While Japanese admirals met in secured conference rooms in Tokyo, believing their communications were impenetrable, American cryptanalysts were decoding their messages, sometimes within hours of transmission, while Japanese radio operators carefully enciphered their traffic using codebooks and cipher tables they trusted with their lives. American intercept stations were recording every transmission, storing them on paper, and sending them to Pearl Harbor for analysis. While Japanese naval intelligence congratulated itself on operational security, the enemy was reading not just their intentions but their exact dispositions, their fuel states, their aircraft complements, even the names of commanding officers. The foundation of Japanese naval planning in the Pacific rested on a single assumption, that their codes were secure. Everything else, every strategic calculation, every tactical maneuver, every operational plan, depended on the enemy not knowing what was coming. That assumption was catastrophically wrong. And the moment when Rochefort's team identified what AF represented would be the moment when 6 months of Japanese planning became worse than useless. It became a guide for the Americans, a roadmap to Japanese intentions written by the Japanese themselves. The Japanese Navy's confidence in its cryptographic security was not baseless arrogance. It was built on what appeared to be sound mathematical and procedural foundations. The primary operational code used by the Imperial Japanese Navy in 1942 was designated JN-25 by American cryptanalysts. The Japanese called it by various administrative designations, but to the men trying to break it, JN-25 was the target, the puzzle, the obsession. JN25 was what cryptographers call a super-enciphered code. This meant it had 2 layers of security, not 1. The first layer was a codebook. Japanese radio operators did not transmit messages in plain language. Instead, they converted words, phrases, and concepts into 5-digit code groups using a codebook that contained approximately 45,000 entries. The word battleship might be represented by the code group 32791. The phrase proceed to might be 48165. Entire sentences could be reduced to strings of 5-digit groups that appeared to be random numbers. But the Japanese did not stop there. After encoding the message into 5-digit groups, operators applied a second layer of encryption using an additive system. They would take each 5-digit code group and mathematically add another 5-digit number from a separate cipher table. This addition was not simple arithmetic. It used a system called false addition or non-carrying addition, where if any column exceeded 9, you simply used the last digit without carrying to the next column. The result was another 5-digit group that appeared completely random and bore no obvious relationship to the original code group. To read a message, you needed both the codebook and the cipher additives. You needed to know which version of the codebook was in use, because the Japanese periodically changed codebooks entirely, rendering all previous cryptanalytic work useless. You needed to know which cipher table was being applied, because different naval districts and different ship types sometimes used different additives. And you needed to intercept the message in the first place, which meant having radio operators listening to the right frequencies at the right times, recording transmissions that might last only seconds. The Japanese had additional security measures. They used abbreviated codes for common phrases. They employed address groups that identified recipients without revealing unit designations. They changed call signs regularly to prevent traffic analysis. They imposed strict radio silence for ships conducting sensitive operations. They physically destroyed old codebooks and cipher tables according to rigid schedules to prevent capture. Japanese cryptographic officers had studied American and British code-breaking efforts from the First World War. They knew that codes could be broken through statistical analysis, through captured documents, through operator errors. They believed JN25 was secure against all these threats. The codebook was too large to reconstruct through traffic analysis alone. The additive system meant that even if you somehow obtained the codebook, you still could not read messages without the cipher tables. And the frequent changes to both codebooks and additives meant that any breakthrough would be temporary at best. In Tokyo, the cryptographic section of the Naval General Staff regularly assessed the security of their communications. They monitored international cryptographic literature. They reviewed their own procedures for weaknesses. Their conclusion, reaffirmed repeatedly through 1941 and into 1942, was that JN25 was effectively unbreakable by any enemy who did not physically possess both the current codebook and the current cipher tables. Japanese admirals planned their operations confident that the Americans were deaf and blind to Japanese intentions. They believed they could move fleets across the Pacific in secret. They believed they could mass forces for surprise attacks. They believed their advantage in operational security compensated for American advantages in industrial production and raw military power. The United States Navy's code-breaking effort did not begin with Pearl Harbor. It began decades earlier, in the 1920s, when a small group of officers and civilians recognized that radio communications would be the nervous system of modern naval warfare, and that whoever could intercept and decode enemy radio traffic would have an incalculable advantage. The Office of Naval Intelligence established its Code and Signal Section in 1924. The section was small, poorly funded, and largely ignored by the Navy's operational commanders. Early efforts focused on Japanese diplomatic codes rather than military codes. The work was painstaking. Cryptanalysts would collect thousands of intercepted messages, looking for patterns, repeated groups, cribs, any foothold into the structure of the code. By the mid-1930s, the Navy had established intercept stations at several locations. Stations in Washington, the Philippines, Guam, and Hawaii recorded Japanese radio transmissions. The raw intercepts, thousands of 5-digit groups written on paper or punched into cards, were forwarded to analysis centers where cryptanalysts worked to break the codes. The man who would become central to this effort was born in California in 1898. Joseph John Rochefort joined the Navy in 1918, served briefly on destroyers, and showed an aptitude for languages and mathematics. In 1925, the Navy sent him to Japan to study the language. He spent 3 years in Tokyo, becoming fluent in Japanese and studying Japanese culture, military traditions, and psychology. When he returned, the Navy assigned him to the Code and Signal section. Rochefort was not a typical naval officer. He wore a smoking jacket instead of a uniform, often working through the night in the basement spaces of whatever building housed his operation. He chain-smoked, drank coffee by the pot, and approached code-breaking with the intensity of obsession. He understood that breaking codes was not just mathematics. It required understanding the enemy's mind, their vocabulary, their procedures, their habits. By 1941, Rochefort commanded Station Hypo, the code-breaking unit at Pearl Harbor. The station occupied cramped, windowless spaces in the basement of the 14th Naval District building. The rooms were filled with filing cabinets containing intercepts, charts showing traffic analysis, desks where cryptanalysts worked with pencils and paper, and IBM tabulating machines that could sort and compare code groups. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, did not destroy Station Hypo. The cryptanalysts continued working, through the attack, recording Japanese radio traffic, noting new code groups, observing communication patterns. In the weeks after Pearl Harbor, breaking JN-25 became the highest priority intelligence mission in the Pacific. The Japanese had changed the codebook and cipher additives on December 1, 1941, just before the Pearl Harbor attack. This change, which the Americans called a system change, rendered months of previous cryptanalytic work obsolete. Rochefort's team had to start over, rebuilding their understanding of the code from scratch. They began with fundamentals. Traffic analysis showed which ships were communicating with which commands. Direction finding, using multiple intercept stations to triangulate radio transmissions, showed where ships were located. Cribs, known or suspected phrases that appeared in messages, provided entry points. The work of breaking JN-25 was not the romantic vision of code breaking that would later appear in films and novels. It was not brilliant individuals having sudden flashes of insight. It was industrial-scale intellectual labor, performed by dozens of people working in shifts, 7 days a week, using methods that were systematic, repetitive, and exhausting. Station Hypo employed approximately 70 people by early 1942. About 30 were cryptanalysts and linguists. The rest were radio operators, IBM machine operators, clerks, and administrative personnel. The cryptanalysts included naval officers like Rochefort, civilian experts hired for their mathematical or linguistic skills, and Marine and Navy enlisted men trained in cryptanalysis. Among them were men who would become legends in the cryptographic community. Thomas Dyer, a naval officer with a gift for recognizing patterns. Wesley Wright, known as Ham, who could see relationships between code groups that others missed. And Jasper Holmes, a former submarine commander who brought operational knowledge to the part. Analytical process. The basement where they worked was not designed for round-the-clock operations. The spaces were cramped, poorly ventilated, and insufferably hot. Air conditioning was minimal. The IBM tabulating machines generated heat. The air was thick with cigarette smoke. Men worked in undershirts, sweating through shifts that often stretched 12 or 16 hours. Sleep was taken in shifts, sometimes on cots in side rooms, sometimes not at all when a breakthrough seemed imminent. The process of attacking JN-25 began with the intercepts themselves. Radio operators at stations across the Pacific monitored Japanese frequencies constantly. When they heard a transmission, they recorded it by hand, writing down the 5-digit groups as fast as the Japanese operators sent them. A single message might contain 50 or 100 groups. A busy day might produce dozens of messages. All these intercepts were forwarded to Station Hypo. The first step was sorting and cataloguing. Each intercept received an identification number. The date, time, frequency, and originating station were recorded. The messages were then typed onto index cards or punched into IBM cards. This created a searchable database of intercepted traffic that could be analyzed for patterns. Traffic analysis came next. Even without breaking the code, analysts could learn valuable information from studying who was sending messages to whom, how often they communicated, and when traffic increased or decreased. A sudden surge of messages from a particular naval unit suggested increased operational activity. A ship that had been transmitting regularly and then went silent might be preparing for an operation requiring radio silence. The actual cryptanalytic work began with identifying the structure of the code. Analysts knew JN-25 was a super-enciphered code, but they needed to determine the patterns of the cipher additives. They looked for repeated groups in different messages. If the same 5-digit group appeared in multiple messages sent at different times, it might represent a common word or phrase. By collecting thousands of these repeated groups and analyzing their contexts, cryptanalysts could begin to hypothesize meanings. Cribs were essential. A crib was a known or suspected piece of plaintext that appeared in an encrypted message. Japanese messages often contained predictable elements: date-time groups, weather reports, location indicators. If analysts suspected a particular 5-digit group represented truck because it appeared frequently in messages that traffic analysis suggested were related to the major Japanese base at Truck Lagoon, they could test that hypothesis. If the hypothesis held up across multiple messages, they had recovered one code group. Each recovered code group was recorded in what the analysts called a codebook recovery, essentially building their own version of the Japanese codebook. By early 1942, Station IPO had recovered several thousand code groups from JN-25. This was only about 10% of the total codebook, but it was enough to begin reading portions of messages. A message might be 40% readable, with key words and phrases recovered while other sections remained garbled. But 40% was often enough to understand the general meaning, especially when combined with traffic analysis and operational context. The cipher additive system was harder to crack. Without knowing the additive that had been applied to a code group, analysts could not determine the original 5-digit code number even if they had intercepted it. The breakthrough came from studying messages sent to multiple recipients. Japanese radio operators, in a violation of proper procedure, sometimes sent the same message to multiple commands using different cipher additives for each recipient. By comparing these messages, cryptanalysts could use differential cryptanalysis to strip away the additives and recover the underlying code groups. By April 1942, Station Hypo was reading perhaps 15 to 20% of JN-25 traffic with reasonable accuracy. This was not enough to read complete messages, but it was enough to provide operational intelligence about Japanese movements and intentions. Rochefort's team would work on a message for hours or days, gradually recovering more groups, consulting their growing code book, making educated guesses about unclear sections, until they had enough to write an intelligence summary for Pacific Fleet headquarters upstairs. In early May 1942, Station Hypo began intercepting Japanese messages that referenced a major operation scheduled for early June. The messages were fragmentary, partially readable, frustrating in their incompleteness. But certain elements appeared repeatedly. The operation had a designation. The target had a designation, AF, and the forces being committed were massive, message after Message referenced AF. Supply ships were being loaded for AF. Air units were being assigned to AF. Transport ships would carry occupation forces to AF. The Japanese were planning not just a raid but an invasion, an operation to seize and hold territory. Traffic analysis showed that carriers were involved. Multiple carrier divisions were mentioned in the intercepts. Battleships were mentioned. This was not a minor operation. This was the combined fleet operating in force. The critical intelligence problem was simple. What was AF? Without knowing the target, the Americans could not position their forces to intercept. They could not prepare defenses. They could not turn Japanese planning into an American advantage. The Pacific Fleet had 3 operational carriers after Coral Sea: Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, which was damaged but being rushed through repairs at Pearl Harbor. The Japanese had 4 or possibly 5 carriers available. If the Americans guessed wrong about AF, if they positioned their carriers to defend the wrong location, the Japanese would achieve surprise and the Americans would lose control of the Pacific. Rochefort believed AF was Midway. The evidence was circumstantial but compelling. Midway appeared in messages with AF. The timing matched what would be required for an operation against Midway. The forces being committed matched what would be needed to seize and hold Midway, and Midway made strategic sense. The small atoll, 1,100 miles northwest of Hawaii, was the westernmost American outpost in the Central Pacific. If Japan could seize Midway, they would have an advance base for operations against Hawaii itself. They would force the American carriers to respond, creating the decisive fleet engagement Japanese doctrine sought. But Rochefort could not prove it. Other intelligence officers believed AF was Hawaii itself, another strike at Pearl Harbor. Some thought AF might be Alaska or the Aleutians. The Japanese had been active in the 30 North Pacific. They might be planning a diversionary attack there. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commanding the Pacific Fleet from his headquarters at Pearl Harbor, needed certainty. He needed proof. He could not commit his 3 carriers, the only force capable of challenging Japanese naval power, based on an educated guess. Second CTA at approximately 2,900 words. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Rochefort devised a test. It was simple, elegant, and depended on Japanese procedures. He proposed that Midway send a radio message in plain language, unencrypted, reporting a fake emergency. Midway would report that their fresh water distillation plant had broken down and they were experiencing a water shortage. This message would be transmitted on a frequency the Americans knew the Japanese monitored. If Midway was indeed AF, Japanese intelligence would report the water problem to their commands. And if that report was sent using JN-25, Station Hypo would intercept it. Nimitz approved the plan. On May 19th, Midway transmitted in plain language that they were experiencing problems with their water distillation system. Radio operators at Station Hypo listened to Japanese frequencies, recording every transmission, waiting for the test to pay off. 2 days later, on May 21st, they intercepted a Japanese message. The message was encoded in JN-25. It was partially readable, and it reported that AF was short of water. Rochefort had his proof. AF was Midway. The Japanese were coming to Midway, and now the Americans knew not just the target but the approximate timing, the forces involved, and even some of the tactical details of the operation. 6 months of Japanese planning had been compromised. The enemy knew their intentions, and the Japanese had no idea they had been betrayed by their own communications. With AF identified, as Midway, Station Hypo intensified its efforts to extract every possible detail from Japanese radio traffic. The intercepts were coming faster now as the operation approached. Japanese commands were coordinating fleet movements, air operations, logistical support, and amphibious landings. Each message was a piece of intelligence. Each decoded fragment revealed more of the Japanese plan. By late May, Rochefort's team had reconstructed the essential outline of the Japanese operation. The attack would begin on June 4th. Japanese carrier aircraft would strike Midway at dawn, destroying American air defenses and softening up the island for invasion. While the carriers operated northwest of Midway, an invasion force would approach from the southwest, carrying 2,500 troops to occupy the atoll. A separate diversionary force would attack the Aleutian Islands in Alaska, drawing American attention north while the main operation unfolded at Midway. The force committed to the operation was staggering. 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, the same carriers that had struck Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier, 2 battleships in the carrier-striking force. Another group of battleships following behind, including Yamato, the largest battleship ever built, heavy and light cruisers, dozens of destroyers, submarines deployed to intercept American ships, approximately 200 carrier aircraft, shore-based air units that would occupy Midway after its capture, supply ships, tankers, and transports. The combined fleet was operating as a unified force for the first time since Pearl Harbor. The Americans knew this because they were reading the communications. Partially, incompletely, with gaps and uncertainties, but reading them nonetheless. Messages revealed ship names, commander names, unit designations, movement schedules, and operational objectives. Station Hypo produced intelligence summaries that went directly to Nimitz, giving him information no American admiral had possessed before, advanced knowledge of enemy intentions at the operational level. Japanese radio operators had no idea they were compromised. They followed their procedures. They used their codebooks and cipher tables correctly. They maintained radio discipline. They did everything their training required. But the procedures themselves were compromised. The code they trusted was being read. Not perfectly, not completely, but enough. More than enough. In Tokyo, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the combined fleet, reviewed the final operation plans with confidence. Yamamoto was the architect of the Pearl Harbor attack. He understood American capabilities better than most Japanese officers. He had lived in America, studied at Harvard, served as naval attaché in Washington. He knew American industrial power would eventually overwhelm Japan if the war continued indefinitely. His strategy was to force a decisive engagement early, to destroy American carrier forces before they could be reinforced, to demonstrate Japanese superiority so convincingly that America would negotiate rather than continue a costly war. The Midway operation was designed to accomplish this. By threatening Midway, Yamamoto would force the Americans to commit their carriers. The Japanese would outnumber them. The Japanese would have surprise. The Americans would sail into a trap. The combined fleet would destroy the American carriers in a decisive battle, just as the Japanese combined fleet had destroyed the Russian Baltic Fleet at Tsushima in 1905, the great Japanese naval victory that ended the Russo-Japanese War. Every element of the plan had been refined. War games had been conducted at the Naval Staff College in Tokyo. Officers had played out the battle on tabletop maps, moving model ships, calculating engagement ranges, and aircraft sortie rates. When the war games suggested problems with the plan, such as American carriers appearing unexpectedly, the umpires had arbitrarily ruled that such outcomes were unlikely, and the games had continued based on optimistic assumptions. Security had been absolute. Operation orders were distributed only at the last possible moment. Ships maintained radio silence as they moved into position. Submarines were stationed along expected American approach routes to provide early warning. Reconnaissance aircraft would search ahead of the fleet. Every precaution was in place. Nothing had been left to chance, except one assumption, the assumption that their codes were secure. That assumption was catastrophically wrong. And while Yamamoto planned in confidence, Rochefort was reading his mail. Admiral Chester Nimitz took the intelligence from Station Hypo and made a decision that would alter the course of the Pacific War. He would ambush the ambushers. The three American carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, rushed through repairs at Pearl Harbor, would position themselves northeast of Midway before the Japanese arrived. They would wait in silence, maintaining strict radio discipline, invisible to Japanese reconnaissance. When the Japanese carriers launched their strike against Midway, when their flight decks were crowded with aircraft being rearmed and refueled, the Americans would attack. The Americans sailed from Pearl Harbor in late May. Enterprise and Hornet departed on May 28th. Yorktown, her repairs incomplete but sufficient for combat, departed on May 30th. The ships moved to a position designated Point Luck, 200 miles northeast of Midway, and waited. Japanese submarines that were supposed to be watching for American ships had arrived late, after the carriers had already passed. Japanese reconnaissance aircraft searching for American forces found nothing. The trap was set. The battle began at dawn on June 4, 1942, exactly as Station Hypo's intelligence had predicted. Japanese carriers launched their strike against Midway. American aircraft from Midway, warned by the codebreakers of the attack's timing, were already airborne or dispersed to avoid destruction on the ground. The Japanese attack damaged Midway's facilities but did not knock out the island's defenses. More critically, the attack left Japanese carriers vulnerable, their flight decks cluttered with aircraft, fuel lines running across open decks, ammunition stored for quick access. American carrier aircraft, launched from Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, based on Rochefort's intelligence about Japanese positions, found the Japanese fleet. The first attacks failed. Torpedo bombers flying low and slow were slaughtered by Japanese fighters and anti-aircraft fire. 41 torpedo bombers attacked, 35 were shot down. Not a single torpedo hit, but the torpedo attacks had pulled Japanese fighters down to low altitude. They were there, at sea level, massacring the American torpedo bombers when American dive bombers arrived at altitude. The dive bombers had gotten lost, searching for the Japanese fleet. They had found nothing where they expected the carriers to be. Some ran low on fuel and returned to their ships. Others kept searching. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, leading Enterprise's dive bombers, made a calculated guess based on a Japanese destroyer's wake and turned his formation in that direction. At 10:22 in the morning, he saw them. 4 Japanese carriers, exactly where Rochefort's intelligence had said they would be, steaming in formation, their flight decks crowded with aircraft being rearmed for a second strike. McCluskey's dive bombers pushed over into their attack runs. The Japanese carriers had almost no fighter cover at altitude. Anti-aircraft fire was intense but not sufficient. The dive bombers screamed down through 6,000 feet of sky and released their 1,000-pound bombs at the last possible moment. Akagi was hit by at least 1 bomb, possibly 2. The bombs penetrated the flight deck and detonated among aircraft being fueled and armed. Secondary explosions tore through the ship. Cargo was hit by 4 bombs in quick succession. Fires spread out of control. Soryu was hit by 3 bombs. She was abandoned within 20 minutes. 3 Japanese fleet carriers were burning, destroyed as effective fighting units in the space of 5 minutes. The 4th carrier, Hiryu, launched a counterattack that damaged Yorktown, but American aircraft found Hiryu that afternoon and destroyed her as well. By the evening of June 4th, all 4 Japanese carriers that had struck Pearl Harbor were sinking or burning. Japan had lost the core of its carrier striking force. More than 300 experienced naval aviators were dead, men who could not be replaced. The ships could theoretically be replaced, given time and industrial capacity. But the pilots and crews represented years of training and combat experience that were gone forever. The Battle of Midway was the decisive naval engagement of the Pacific War. Japan never again attempted offensive operations on the scale of the Midway operation. American industrial production, building new carriers, new aircraft, new everything at rates Japan could not match, would overwhelm Japanese defenses over the following 3 years. But Midway was the turning point, the moment when Japanese offensive momentum stopped and American counteroffensive began. And Midway was won not on June 4th when the bombs hit the carriers, but in the preceding weeks when Station Hypo broke the code and read the plan. The code-breaking triumph at Midway presented American commanders with a problem they had not fully anticipated: how to use intelligence derived from broken codes without revealing to the enemy that their codes were broken. If the Japanese realized JN-25 was compromised, they would change their entire cryptographic system. Months of work would be lost, the advantage would disappear. Every future operation would be planned in darkness, without the intelligence window that Station Hypo provided. After Midway, American commanders became more cautious about acting on code-derived intelligence. If a decoded message revealed that a Japanese supply convoy would be at a specific location at a specific time, American submarines could not simply sail to that exact location and attack. Doing so repeatedly would establish a pattern that Japanese intelligence would eventually recognize. Instead, American forces would position themselves along probable routes and conduct searches that appeared routine. When they found the convoy, the attack would appear to be the result of normal patrol operations, not advanced knowledge. The Japanese did conduct investigations after Midway. Naval intelligence officers reviewed security procedures. They examined whether American reconnaissance aircraft could have spotted the combined fleet and reported its position. They considered whether radio direction finding could have revealed fleet movements. They never seriously considered that JN-25 itself was compromised. The code was too complex, the security too elaborate, the mathematical principles too sound. Japanese cryptographic experts calculated that breaking the code would require resources and time that the Americans could not possibly have devoted to the problem. They were wrong, but their confidence in the code's security was so strong that they interpreted Midway as the result of American luck and Japanese mistakes, not American intelligence superiority. This confidence nearly cost the Americans their advantage. In August 1942, the Chicago Tribune published an article about the Battle of Midway that included details suggesting the Americans had advanced knowledge of Japanese plans. The article did not explicitly mention code breaking, but it came dangerously close. Navy censors were furious. An investigation was launched. The fear was that Japanese intelligence would see the article and realize the implications. Fortunately for the Americans, Japanese intelligence apparently did not monitor American newspapers closely enough to catch the article, or if they did, they dismissed it as speculation rather than revelation. JN-25 remained in use. Joseph Rochefort received the Distinguished Service Medal for his work on Midway. But the award came with complications. Navy bureaucracy and inter-service rivalries meant that Rochefort's contributions were not fully recognized during the war. In September 1942, he was reassigned from Station Hypo to other duties. The official reason was rotation of personnel. The real reasons involved conflicts with Washington-based intelligence officers who resented Rochefort's independent approach and his direct communications with Nimitz. Rochefort's reassignment was one of the Navy's great personnel mistakes. The man who had provided the intelligence that won Midway spent the rest of the war in positions that did not utilize his unique talents. He retired from the Navy in 1947 and died in 1976. In 1986, 10 years after his death, the Navy posthumously awarded him the Distinguished Service Medal he had earned at Midway, correcting a bureaucratic injustice that had stood for 44 years. Station Hypo continued its work throughout the war. The unit expanded, adding more personnel, more IBM machines, more intercept stations. As the war progressed and American forces advanced across the Pacific, the Codebreakers provided intelligence that shaped operations at every level. They read Japanese messages about ship movements, allowing submarines to position themselves for ambushes. They decoded reports of aircraft deployments, giving American commanders knowledge of enemy air strength. They intercepted logistical messages about fuel and ammunition shortages, revealing vulnerabilities in Japanese supply lines. One of the most controversial uses of code-derived intelligence came in April 1943, when decoded messages revealed that Admiral Yamamoto would be flying to Bougainville in the Solomon Islands on a specific date, on a specific route, at a specific time. American commanders faced a decision. They could ambush Yamamoto's aircraft, killing the architect of Pearl Harbor and the most capable admiral in the Japanese Navy. But doing so would strongly suggest that American intelligence had advanced knowledge, potentially compromising the code. The decision was made at the highest levels. The risk was acceptable. The opportunity was too valuable. On April 18, 1943, American P-38 fighters intercepted Yamamoto's transport aircraft and shot it down over the jungles of Bougainville. Yamamoto died in the crash. The Japanese suspected American intelligence might have been involved, but they conducted another investigation of their codes and again concluded that JN-25 was secure. The story of Station Hypo and the breaking of JN-25 is not simply a story about clever men solving mathematical puzzles. It is a story about how industrial warfare depends on information as much as it depends on weapons and soldiers. The Japanese planned their operations in secret, as militaries had done for thousands of years, believing that secrecy itself was a strategic advantage. But in the age of radio communications and industrial-scale cryptanalysis, secrecy was an illusion that could be shattered by men with pencils and paper working in basement rooms. The psychological dimension of this story is profound. Japanese admirals planned for 6 months, confident that their intentions were hidden. They committed the combined fleet to an operation they believed would surprise and destroy American naval power. They based everything on the assumption that the enemy would react to events rather than anticipate them. That assumption was wrong from the beginning. The Americans knew. Not everything, not perfectly, but enough. And that knowledge transformed Japanese planning from an advantage into a liability. Every message the Japanese sent to coordinate their forces was a message the Americans read. Every detail they transmitted was a detail the Americans knew. The elaborate operation orders, the carefully calculated fuel requirements, the precise timing of strikes and invasions, all of it was intelligence for the enemy. The men in the Japanese combined fleet who died at Midway were not betrayed by cowardice or incompetence. They were betrayed by a technical failure their own cryptographic experts had assured them was impossible. The codes their leadership trusted absolutely were being read by the enemy. The security measures they relied on were inadequate, and when they sailed into battle confident of surprise and numerical superiority, they were sailing into an ambush prepared by an enemy who had read their operation orders. The codebreakers at Station Hypo worked in obscurity during the war. Their contribution was classified for years after 1945. When histories of the Pacific War were written in the immediate post-war years, Midway was attributed to American courage, to dive bomber pilots pressing home their attacks, to Admiral Nimitz's calculated risk-taking. All these factors mattered, but they mattered because Rochefort's team had put the American carriers in the right place at the right time, armed with knowledge of Japanese intentions that turned what could have been a Japanese victory into a catastrophic Japanese defeat. The industrial dimension of the story is equally important. The Americans could devote resources to code-breaking on a scale the Japanese never imagined. Station Hypo was one of several code-breaking units. There were similar operations in Washington, in Australia, in the Aleutians. There were hundreds of radio intercept operators listening to Japanese frequencies around the clock. There were IBM, machines sorting and comparing millions of code groups. There was a bureaucratic apparatus that could support this work, fund it, staff it, and integrate its product into operational planning. Japan had cryptanalytic capabilities, but nothing approaching American scale. This was industrial warfare applied to intelligence, and like every other aspect of industrial warfare, Superior resources and organization produced superior results. The irony at the heart of this story is absolute and crushing. Japanese admirals spent 6 months planning an operation they believed would be secret until the moment of execution. American codebreakers knew the essential details within weeks of the planning's beginning. The advantage Japanese commanders thought they possessed, the ability to move and strike in secret, was an illusion. The Americans were reading their mail, and when the Japanese carriers launched their aircraft against Midway on June 4, 1942, confident they were, achieving surprise, American carriers were waiting for them, positioned based on decoded Japanese messages, ready to turn Japanese planning into American victory. The basement room at Pearl Harbor, where Rochefort stood on May 25th, holding a decoded fragment that identified AF as Midway, was as important to Allied victory as any factory building Sherman tanks or any shipyard launching carriers. Information was a weapon. Breaking codes was a form of combat. And the men who worked in the dungeon at Station Hypo, sweating through their shifts in cramped spaces filled with cigarette smoke and IBM machines, won battles without ever seeing the enemy. They read messages. They broke codes. They provided knowledge. And knowledge, in modern warfare, was often the difference between victory and defeat. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.